It is absolutely an honor to get to be with you all today. Thank you so much for including us in this conversation at the Institute, which has been such a center for the study of pharmacy and pharmaceuticals and medicine more capaciously. Thank you, Lucas, for the invitation, for Tyler for making it happen, and congratulations in the deepest way to both Ellen and to John for their well-earned awards today. I'm zooming in today from Clinton, from Hamilton College, where 135 years ago, William Bristol and John Myers studied before they founded what this little historical society plaque dubbed the world-famous Bristol-Myers Company. It was launched as the Clinton Pharmaceutical Company on the second floor of this building in 1887. Given that this space has now become our lone coffee shop in the village of Clinton, perhaps in our moment we've partially inverted the trend that this 1909 cartoon, accessed by the Institute's digital collections, mocked. Look behind you, it's titled. Here, a prohibition agitator shines a hopeful light on a cafe, closed for business despite advertising wine and beers and cigars in the window. Behind him, though, glows a drugstore, always open, complete with cocaine, morphia, drugs, and drinks, with liquor sold on prescriptions. Our talk today touches on this balance between licit and illicit pharmaceuticals, the institutions that kept them, and the balance between what was supposed to be on hand and what was actually available. But unlike this cartoon, when we say, look behind you, we really mean in a historical sense. And we propose that to understand deep trends in the history of pharmacy, one ought to look far back, as indeed many of the scholars here have also suggested, to a long history of pharmacopeias from antiquity to 1850. So our project Global Pharmacopeias is a platform for historical sources on natural products, and that is to say medicinally powerful substances extracted from nature, and the pharmaceutical preparations used in past societies. This collection, and as Dan is going to discuss, isn't really a data set, features assemblages of medicaments found in apothecaries' inventories and similar lists of materia medica used around Europe, European imperial dominions, and other regions from antiquity to 1850. Ultimately, GP, as we've started to call it, and these are early days, will establish comparisons across pharmacopeias, both published and manuscript, in a form that is accessible, hopefully to historians of pharmacy, of course, but also perhaps to medical historians, medical researchers, ethnobotanists, and biochemists. The Global Pharmacopeias dataset centers not on patented tonics or apothecary recipes, but instead on these natural products, which are heralded as medically potent. For example, take snake root. As many of you know, the drug reserpine occasionally prescribed in the US for hypertension through the 1990s. It was isolated from the root of the Indian climbing shrub, Rauvolfia serpentina, in the 1950s. Following scientists' analysis of Ayurvedic medicines. In this 1955 Indian Gift 3-poster set, designed by a New Jersey pharmacist and now housed in the Institute's collections, we can see how marketers championed Indian snake root using essentialist tropes of exotic nature known only to traditional experts. The poster suggests that snake root had provided Indian people a means of treating a whole variety of diseases for countless centuries. And that's a quote. The smaller slide panel contends that, quote, in search of new drugs, colleges of pharmacy and the pharmaceutical industry are now exploring the properties of old plant drugs, some of which are even mentioned in the Bible, end quote. With illustrations that combine microscopes and syringes and clocks with botanical illustration and turbaned purveyors of snake root sitting outside of a temple, these advertisements toggled between modernity and essentialized ancient knowledge. The other side of the triptych reads, quote, only recently purified extracts of snake root are proving to be one of the most important therapeutic developments in the history of psychiatry, end quote. So for the mind and for the heart, snake root seemed to offer myriad potential. This aggrandizement of raw nature as medical, wrapped in a local but distant knowledge, is an extremely old tactic for selling drugs. By employing its vernacular name, consumers and scientists' confidence in Indian snake root built on other snake roots, such as the North American Atina altissima, or white snake root. For example, some version of snake root appears in this 1814 advertisement of drugs and medicines just received near where I am now in the Columnia de Gazette of Utica, New York. Now, my colleague David Gapp has used this list in his teaching to show the diverse array of medicines known in the 19th century, connecting botany to the history of medicine. Oh, we have a little freezing happening here. That's okay. Drug merchants provided some, like Peruvian bark, pink root, and cochineal, as symbols, inherently potent when drawn from nature. Others, though, were compound medicines. A list like this, which we in GP would characterize as a functional pharmacopoeia, is replete with information. It reflects the odds and sods of Solomon Walcott's drugstore, but it also suggests a balance between local and global medicines. Ultimately, it participates in a tradition of medical list-making with its root in antiquity and elaborated in the documentary and medical culture of Europe. But one of the greatest challenges in researching medicines derived from nature and their uses are the layers of uncertainty and the radically different approaches to what it means to know a medicine. Many, many different plants have been known as some variant of snake root. Are they plants used against snake bites, or plants with roots that look like snakes? Are they black or are they white? And while Linnaean taxonomy helps naming a plant and thinking about its geographic distribution, medical experts in the past often didn't think in such terms. And while substances used medicinally often have identifiable bioactive compounds, experts only started talking about these structures in the last few hundred years. Still, the term itself carries a placeholder of meaning, and that snake root is presumed valuable by marketers and readers because it means something regardless of its provenance. So, what might we be able to know about the history of pharmaceutical consumption by reading for snake root capaciously across many texts describing parallel medicinal natures? Put simply, that's what GP aims to do. In the vision of Matthew Crawford and Joseph Gabriel, pharmacopoeia is an intrinsically ambiguous term. It refers, on one hand, to the genre of medical writing that lists simple and compound medicaments, as well as the techniques for preparing and administering these medicaments according to a specific tradition. More broadly, though, they suggest that the term pharmacopoeia has been used to refer to the collective knowledge of medical cultures and the therapeutic preparations of different substances as held by any society, culture, or group of specialists within a society or culture. Pharmacopoeia, then, are lists of medicaments that are always more than lists of medicaments. Pablo Gomez has even expanded that term to be a social pharmacopoeia, encompassing oral and practical traditions of medicine beyond text. To research that expansive definition, one needs to look at inquisitorial records and recipes, locating an archive of practice replete with medical knowledge. Such reconstructive projects have been very useful for understanding the vast knowledge left unwritten. Look no further than the Making Knowing Project or the Recipes Initiative. But GP's approach is different. It's fundamentally textual and interested in the making of data. As Dan will suggest, GP aims to think about the genre of pharmacopoeia as a list. Building on the work of Jack Goody, we can read lists as aspiring to completeness in a way that narrative does not. For now, it's enough to say that we're interested in rendering comparable pharmacopoeias of listed medicaments, reading across them for changes over time, space, and assemblage. So, what we're looking at and what we're not looking at. Take a selection of the 1498 Recetario Fiorentino, the first published European pharmacopoeia, as our example. We're interested in the left-hand page on this slide. What can we learn from the lists of simples that an apothecary would have on hand in the bodega? Here we have the usual flowers like rose and chamomile, and leaves like mint and salvia and dragontea. These natural products are often characterized as at the start of a published reference pharmacopoeia. Thus far in the project, we've been less focused on the narrative descriptions of remedies, like the page on the right, which centers recipes, like the recreation of some of Mesuet's remedies. In published reference pharmacopoeia, like the recetario here, these often appear in the second half. In short, this is not really a recipe project. As we've thought about different pharmacopoeia, we've started to think about categories that traverse these documents. The highest order distinction is, at the moment to our minds, a difference between reference and functional pharmacopoeia. Reference pharmacopoeias, like the Recetario Fiorentino, are designed to represent the ideal type of medicaments one could or should have on hand. By contrast, though, functional pharmacopoeias characterize existing stores or collections. In functional pharmacopoeias, we can see what people actually had on hand, like in that advertisement from the Utica Gazette. So here's another example of a functional versus a reference pharmacopoeia. These from the archives of the Nobile Collegio in Rome. In this handwritten list of medicaments held in the pharmacy of a woman named Anna, who, signed her name here, good penmanship be damned, we find many medicaments known as women's cures, such as betony, along with more locally sourced natural products than those featured on reference pharmacopoeia lists, like price lists or tariff lists, also available for the same geography at the same year. So printing certainly mattered when it came to establishing the trans-regional authority of European pharmacopoeias. But while important benchmarks, the first editions of the Recetario Fiorentino or the first edition of the Concordiae published in Barcelona in 1511 had relatively small runs. They might be reference pharmacopoeia, but as Emily Beck has shown, they didn't have overwhelming authority at their time. So by appreciating the overlaps between print and manuscript traditions, we hope that GP will add nuance to apothecaries' aspirational hegemony over medicinal practice. So what do we hope to get out of all of this? Our expectation is that users will not turn to GP to sit down and read a pharmacopoeia. You could go to a library or an archive or just Google Books for that. Instead, GP will do what many scholars of pharmacopoeia actually do, but make it kind of more machine readable. It will comprise an actionable data set. We'll tag these pharmacopoeias and make it possible for other researchers to join in that effort. Such a data set will make it possible to observe things like relative frequency, how common is snake root or bezoar stones, or more precisely, how frequently are medical terms that correlated to snake root or bezoars mentioned. Does that frequency change over time? For instance, with bezoars, we really see an uptick in popularity from 1500 to 1700, and then they really fall off quite precipitously. We're also really interested in geographic distribution. We will be able to see whether snake root is mentioned as more commonly collected in 13th century England or 17th century Italy. This will enable us to trace more phenomena like the rising popularity of New World medicaments, which indigenous American medicines moved transregionally, and which, like psychedelics, largely did not. Now, many scholars have done some versions of this type of research, but what we're suggesting is a more systematic process by which many of these statistics across a whole variety of different pharmacopoeia are rendered machine readable. And finally, we're interested in tracing patterns of assemblages, or what medicaments appear in tandem. This will move away from the proclivity toward itinerary history and instead showcase how certain remedies became adopted in one area to the next, moving together as more than one medicament at once. So this is an exciting moment for machine learning and textual digitization writ large. We've also had the benefit of learning from other projects interested in trans-regional drug trades. For example, the Dutch project Time Capsule has sought to trace references to drug components in published pharmacopoeia, archaeological findings, cargo, and natural distributions, largely focused on Leiden and other European medical networks. The Drugs Across Asia project has linked 392 Chinese medical manuscripts from the pre-modern period as a key resource for the foundations of traditional Chinese medicine. This medical system is often parallel to the European tradition from which modern pharmaceuticals developed. We aim to explore building in links to the drug identifiers listed by both of these projects as we explore how Europeans consolidated their medical knowledge and imposed it on other regions to make one global system of drug discovery. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dan, for whom I've already learned so much about working with manuscripts, lists, and pre-modern material culture.
Thanks, Mackenzie. I'm just delighted to join you for this, and let me add my voice to Mackenzie's with my thanks and congratulations. I'm a complete neophyte when it comes to the history of medicine, and when I first began talking with Mackenzie about this project, I just leapt at the chance to join this because there's so much to learn. And just now, Mackenzie, actually, just what you ran through was utterly fascinating, and I can't wait to follow up on so much of it. So I'm just going to take a very few minutes here to describe some of the work that my group at Harvard and I have been doing, and why it's relevant to this project on global pharmacopoeias. We're going to move away from pharmaceuticals for a moment, because what I'm working on is material culture. What I'd like you to do is exercise your imagination and see how the platform that we've developed for exploring material culture is completely available and adaptable for the study of early pharmaceutical products. What you see here is the front page of this project, the documentary Archaeology of Late Medieval Europe. I've been working on this with colleagues for the last several years. It's a collection of estate inventories and other lists of things from the later Middle Ages in Europe up to about 1500 or so. And the goal is to develop a set of resources for understanding Europe's material culture in the centuries before the emergence of the early modern world system. Obviously we have a lot of evidence and extensive record of material in our art historical record in museums and collections. We can learn a lot about materiality from this, obviously from the architectural heritage as well. But one of the really interesting things about material culture is that it's massively skewed towards things that are durable, that can survive for one reason or another. And the vast majority of things that people own have just not survived in some tangible form that you can see in a museum. So that's why you really have to turn to the documentary record, to text, actually, to fill out this sort of profile of material culture. And the most valuable resource for this is our household inventories. That you find all over medieval Europe, and especially in early modern Europe. And this is also true you also find these for churches and castles and courts. Putting these things together as an assemblage, as the collection, is what we call a documentary archaeology, namely approaching the past through these kinds of documents. This is a map of our holdings right now. We have about 500 published records. There's another 500 awaiting transcription. There's possibly another 10,000 available out there to do. It's an ongoing project. Mackenzie and I first got in touch because, among other things, there's a number of apothecaries inventories that we've come across. And I've always been fascinated by these, and I was fascinated to find that someone else was actually interested in them. I won't say a lot about the infrastructure, but we've put together an infrastructure that allows a really extensive project team to get associated on this project. We have about 100 collaborators in the United States and across Europe. For us, giving credit to people is hugely important. We consider every single record that's contributed to our collection to be owned by the editors, the people who have contributed to the project. And for younger scholars in particular, this is a chance for them to put something on their CV. We've developed a sort of a method or a flow of work that allows us to involve not only very senior scholars, but also graduate research assistants, and a number of undergraduate RAs. The nature of the project actually uses undergraduate workers, researchers, in a really systematic way, and it works really, really well. And it's one way to bring young people into this project. Let me give you just a quick example of a record. This actually is from an apothecary. He's Philippus Lamberti from Marseille. Mackenzie had mentioned the important distinction between lists and narratives. There's a lot of descriptions of material culture in narratives and paintings and things like that. And there's lots of ways you can approach material culture through these, but these are anecdotal and unsystematic. A household inventory, by contrast, is a list. And as Mackenzie mentioned, a list has these really interesting properties, not only of aiming towards completeness, complete list of the contents of a pharmacy or a house, but also it forces people to be intensely aware of the nature of the things they are describing, and they come up with an ontological system for describing it that matches on to our ontology and allows us to piggyback on their sense of what the things are. And that's partly what makes these lists really available for these systematic forms of analysis. Mackenzie has run through some of the three most important for any set like this: relative frequency, spatial location, and co-occurrence. And the fundamental point is that this is not just a collection. We're hoping to create an actionable data set that people can actually use to pursue these kinds of analysis. And let me explain this with the example of this really interesting entity called an alembic. An alembic is a type of distilling equipment. Some of you will have seen it. It's not uncommon in these types of inventories. There's a number of diverse words for alembics that show up in the inventories. If you can advance the slide there. And we are not trying to translate these into a common language. We want to preserve this diversity. So the really important thing is to come up with a method or a system for linking these in an ontology. And I won't run through this slide in detail, but at the bottom, you can see the actual tokens or individual words that appear in records. And if you follow this up through the tree, you can see we're linking the word forms to lexical headwords in various languages. We have about 12 languages in the example in the collection so far. And then finally, most importantly, to this conceptual entity, an alembic that has a barcode or an ID. And we get these for material culture from the Getty Architecture Thesaurus. So if you can just go through the next two slides quickly. This is a thesaurus of material culture, and you can see there the barcode for alembic. This is a unique identifier for this conceptual entity. And the point is to develop a very similar type of thing for global pharmacopeias. With this in hand, we can then do these analyses that Mackenzie had mentioned. And as Mackenzie flips through here, you can see the relative frequency and the spatial location of alembics in the collection. 25% of the inventories of the Crown of Aragon have alembics in them, the 20% in Provence, much fewer in Florence, and we find them not at all in Languedoc and the Lombard Alps in the collection so far. So you get a really good sense about where people are actually using alembics in their practices. So these archival sources are really time-consuming to work with. So I just wanted, in the last minute or so, I just wanted to run through some of the tools that we're trying to speed up production. We can't really accelerate the transcription of records because currently machine recognition of words is not developed. But what we can use are machine learning algorithms to speed up the complex process of making records machine actionable. And this is what our colleague Gabe Pizzorno has been doing. So we can just go to the next slide, Mackenzie, and just tap through. The idea is to take every line phrase and tokenize it, or give every single token word a barcode. And then we run it through these machine learning algorithms that start to recognize the parts of speech associated with each one of them. And then finally, the last stage of this is this very, really technically sophisticated process in linguistics to do dependency parsing, namely to to locate the nature of the dependencies in the phrases. There's a lot of existing models that can do this, and all we have to do is adapt it to the particular languages that we're working with. And the idea is to very rapidly speed up the entry of these records into our database. I'm happy to say a lot more, but Mackenzie, I'm going to pass it back to you now.
Great, Dan. Thanks so much. So I will bring us to a conclusion. I think you've heard about what we intend, and I just want to represent where we are now. These are early days. We're currently working with a team of undergraduate researchers at both Hamilton and Harvard, and a Harvard PhD student, Ryan Lowe. And together we've flagged about 900 pharmacopeias. These come from our own archival digitization efforts and what libraries and archives have already most generously made available. So the collection is particularly robust when it comes to the Spanish American, Iberian, Italian, and French sources, but we have sought to learn more about a variety of pharmacopeias from other regions too, whether lists of medicaments in the Carragoniza corpus, the Dutch West Indies, or the Ottoman world. These include many apothecary inventories and price lists, which feature rich information about measurements and the local and trans-regional value of drugs. At the time, we really do hope that these documents might be used to expand Ronald Zupko's research on pharmaceutical weights and measures. But for the time being, we really aim to publish a subset of 100 pharmacopeias with descriptions, some transcriptions, and some tagging during the GP website launch this winter. So it'll look just like the front end of Dalme, and we intend to publish some short essays on medicament of the month. We have pieces coming out on mumia and saltpeter, as well as an essay on pharmacopoeia of the month, and to have some space for a longer form reflection on something related to the collection. As Dan has pointed out, part of the delight in this platform is its flexibility and openness for credited collaboration. So if you're interested in learning more about writing or transcribing or sharing documents, or if you have a student who you think might be interested, please do reach out. We are very game to collaborate. At least for me, what has emerged from this research so far is a much more personalized vision of the history of pharmacy and a long history of natural product extraction and drug discovery. On one hand, medicines have value because they are comprehensible and tradable across radically different contexts. So reference pharmacopeias often aimed to be global, by which I mean universalizing to the exclusion of particularity. But the many functional pharmacopeias, like this one, which offers pharmaceutical values, ode to Maria de Ayala from the 16th century Spain, show how negotiations around what natural products have medicinal properties, and what they were worth, and also through whom those natural products might be sourced. It's all negotiations. Natural products were personal, especially for those who made their livelihoods from them. For the wider research community, I've really been awed by the enthusiasm for history among the practitioners of pharmaceutical and pharmaceutical-related scientists. I've spoken with many plant scientists, pharmacists, natural product chemists, and many note that either they teach using materials related to the history of pharmacy, or they look into historical data when they're first researching new projects. So certainly, it's often either really challenging or impossible to definitively link a snake root to a particular species of plant. But that possibility continues to enchant some scientists. If access barriers were lowered, could pharmacopeias become a significant resource for a larger portion of the scientific community? After all, over 50% of drugs developed between 1981 and 2014 were derived in one way or another from natural products, which are also valued, of course, as sources of agriculture, cosmetics, and food. Of course, since Tu Youyou won the 2015 Nobel Prize in Medicine using methods drawn from a traditional Chinese herbal to extract the antimalarial artemisinin, the potential for using past knowledge as a resource for pursuing cures in the present has enjoyed growing interest. Maybe there really is something of value in looking behind you, to go back to that cartoon at the beginning of this talk. As importantly, when we focus on natural products, alongside, of course, compound medicine, we come to see a tendency. And that tendency is particularly visible when it comes to early modern Europeans. That is, to read nature as filled with the tools that could enable humanity to live well. In short, that prospect of, as this poster suggests, exploring the properties of old plant drugs, some of which are even mentioned in the Bible, as the 1955 snake root advertisement promoted, resurges time and again, for better and maybe for worse. Thank you.